Hey everybody, it's Ben from EFI University, and there's an old saying that says there's no replacement for displacement. Bigger is always better, but is that really true? Are you sure that it always makes sense to have a bigger engine? Perhaps there's times when it does make sense to stay small, and other times you want to go big or go home. But today we're going to talk about what displacement is and how to choose the right one for your engine. All right, well, when we talk about the displacement of an engine, we're normally talking about the size of the engine. That's typically going to be given to us in like cubic inches or liters. But what does it mean to displace something? It means to move it. So you may have heard it called before that the engine is an air pump. And what we mean by that is as the pistons are going up and down and the cylinders are filling and emptying their airflow, we are literally displacing air. We're taking it in on one side of the engine and shoving it out the other side. Think about what happens. You open the throttle and the air goes from outside through your air cleaner, down through the manifold, into the ports, and it fills the cylinder. Now our intake valve closes and we do the compression and the power stroke, but ultimately that exhaust valve is going to open and we're going to push all that air out so that when we get done, we have literally moved it from one side of the engine to the other. So the displacement of the engine is measured in volume of how much air we move on one engine cycle. Now, it does take 2 revolutions of the crankshaft to complete a cycle, so we'll explore how we can figure out how much airflow an engine should move based on its displacement. All right, so to better help us understand what displacement is, let's break it down and make sure we understand the individual components we're talking about here. Because normally what somebody would tell you is that displacement has something to do with the bore and the stroke, but if you're not sure what those mean, let's talk about it. So the bore is the diameter of the hole we put in the engine block. Now it's limited by how big the physical block is. So you've heard people talk about small blocks and big blocks. They're referring to the physical dimensions of the iron or aluminum cylinder block. So from there we talk about the bore center. That's the distance from the middle of one hole in the block to the next hole down the line, and the next one and the next one, and they'll be spaced out equally. But because of that bore center dimension, the physical size that we can make the hole in the block gets limited. So our bore can only be so big before it starts eating into the next bore over there. So when we talk about stroke, we're really talking about the distance that that piston travels up and down in the bore. But it's important to understand that the crankshaft is controlling that. The crankshaft turns in a circle like this, 360 degrees, but the piston's moving in a straight line up and down. Take a look. So I'm at 0, we'd call this top dead center, and as I rotate the crankshaft around, it's going in a circle and my piston's going down to the bottom. Now I'm at 180 degrees. I continue around, the piston's coming back up in the bore, and now I'm back at top dead center. So that would be the distance my piston has traveled. To understand that, let's take a look at our crankshaft. Now on our crankshaft, it's sitting down the middle of our engine there at the bottom, and it's held in bearings here and here and here, if you look all in a straight line, called main bearings. And then we have the pins here, or the conrod pins, some people call that. Effectively, there's an offset here. If you look at the distance from the center of my main bearing to the center of my rod bearing, that's what we would call the arm, and that's what creates this stroke. It turns in a circle, so that means this distance here at the top is equal to this distance here at the bottom. So if we take this physical spacing here and double it, we would have the length of our actual stroke, or how far the piston physically moves when we go up and down in the block. So to get displacement, what has to happen is the crankshaft's got to turn. So as that piston starts going down, here's my cylinder head. I would have the intake valve open so the air could go in past this valve, down into the cylinder, all the way to the bottom. Now my cylinder volume is as big as it's going to be, so I would close the intake valve. Since the exhaust valve would still be closed as well, as that piston starts to come back up, we're now doing compression. We get to somewhere around top dead center, the spark plug fires. Now the piston's going back down while those hot gases are expanding. This is where we get our power from. We go down to the bottom again. Now we open the exhaust valve and the piston starts to come back up and pushes all that exhaust out the exhaust system, your headers, your mufflers, whatever. But look at what just happened. We took the air from over here inside the engine and we pushed it over there. So we've literally moved or displaced that air. Okay guys, I want to point something out that often gets missed, and that's the relationship between engine revolutions that we all talk about in RPM and engine cycles. You see, we don't actually displace any air until we've completed an engine cycle, and that takes 4 strokes of the piston. That's down, up, but it means that there's 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. So real quick, I'm here at 0. If I go all the way around, there's half a revolution, piston's at the bottom, 1 complete revolution. What I've done is I've done my intake stroke and my compression stroke. Now I got to continue on. Again, back down to bottom dead center. I'm now 1.5 revolutions. I open the exhaust valve, I come back to the top and push it all out. Remember, it took 2 revolutions of the crankshaft to complete 1 cycle of airflow displacement. All right, so now that we understand what the displacement is and what components it takes to get us there, let's try a little math to see how you would determine what your displacement is for your engine. I'm going to use an example similar to this LS engine I have here of a typical Chevy LS, what we would say is a 6-liter engine. So the total displacement of the engine is 6 liters. Now, the Chevy 6-liter LS would typically have a 4-inch diameter bore, so all the way across 4 inches, and it would have a stroke of 3.622 inches. So the math formula to figure out the volume of our displacement would be the area of the bore times the length of the stroke. If you remember your high school math, the area for the circle here of our bore is pi r squared. Since we have a 4-inch diameter, well, that's pretty easy because it makes our radius 2, and if you square it, you get right back to 4. So pi being 3.14 times 4 gives us an area of 12.56 square inches. Now that's our area, so we just multiply that times our distance, in this case our stroke of 3.622 inches, and what you'd get is the volume for one of our cylinders is 45.49 cubic inches, but that's just for one cylinder. So if we take that 45.49 cubic inches times 8, you get pretty close to 364 cubic inches. Now to convert that back into liters, it's about 61 cubic inches per liter. So we could take our 364 cubic inches, divide it by 61, and you'd get 5.96. And so most of the time the OEM manufacturers will just round up or down to get a nice even number, and that's how they came up with the 6-liter LS engine. Well, now that we know what the displacement of the engine is, it's important to remember that that's how much air we're moving on one engine cycle. So how much air we displace total depends on how many engine cycles you're doing, which is directly related to your engine speed. We typically talk about engine speed in RPM, and you may be familiar with airflow ratings that people have talked about, whether it's throttle bodies or maybe carburetors or even cylinder heads when they put them on a flow bench. They use this value that they call CFM. CFM stands for cubic feet per minute of airflow. Imagine a box, if you will, that was 1 foot wide and 1 foot long and 1 foot tall. It would be a cube of air. We're trying to figure out how many of those cubes would go across our air pump in 1 minute. So to figure that out, we have to take the displacement of the engine and multiply that times the number of times we did that displacement. For example, let's say that my 6-liter LS engine was turning at an RPM of 6,000. Now the trick here is that, remember, it takes 2 revolutions of the crankshaft just to do 1 cycle. So I'm going to have to take my engine speed in RPM and divide that in half, because the first revolution is getting the engine full of air and the second revolution empties it back out. So I haven't really displaced it until I've done 2 revolutions. So for example, my 6-liter engine's doing 6,000 RPM, and that's 3,000 cycles per minute. Each cycle is moving 6 liters of air, so that would be 18,000 liters per minute is my airflow. The problem is nobody talks about airflow in liters per minute. We always talk about airflow in cubic feet per minute, so somehow we got to convert. Well, it turns out that there are about 28.3 liters in each cubic foot. So if we take our 18,000 liters per minute and divide it by 28.3, what we would get is a total airflow for our 6-liter engine of 636 CFM at 6,000 RPM. If your engine speed's higher than or lower than 6,000, it's going to change the airflow. Or if your displacement is bigger or smaller than 6 liters, it will also change the airflow. Using this math formula allows us to figure out how much air we should be moving for any given size engine and engine speed. All right, so now that we know what our displacement is and we understand the value of engine speed and engine size to tell us our airflow, if you're watching this channel, it's probably because you're interested in making power, right? So the question becomes, how do I make more power? Well, there's only really a couple different ways we can do that, but it comes down to us being able to extract the heat energy available in fuel. Regardless of what kind of fuel you're using, the fuel contains a certain amount of energy that we can only access by burning that fuel when we combine it with the oxygen available in air. Therefore, we go all the way back to the beginning when we said the engine is an air pump. The more air we can pump in and out, the more fuel we would be able to burn. So you think about it, nobody's ever said the engine's a fuel pump, like if I just double how much fuel I put in the engine, it makes twice as much power. Well, that doesn't happen because the only way we can make all that fuel burn is by combining it with the oxygen in the airflow. So once we've used up all the airflow we have by putting that fuel in there and mixing it together, adding more fuel really isn't going to help anything. So somehow we've got to figure out how to get more airflow. We can only put more fuel in once we gain more airflow. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. The most obvious one should be, well, let's just make a bigger engine. How do I increase my displacement? Well, for starters, I could make the bore bigger. The problem is I get limited. I can only make that circle so big before it intersects the next bore in my engine block, and if that cylinder wall starts getting thinner and thinner, it may not be able to support the loads from all of the cylinder pressure that we get from combustion. As well as the head gasket that's trying to seal that gets really thin between those cylinder bores if you make them too big. So unfortunately, we're kind of boxed in there by the bore center of a given engine. Think about, for example, a small block Ford engine, that distance is 4.380 inches. When you go to a Chevy LS series of engines, you get 4.4 inches, an extra 20 thousandths. Go to a big block Chevy and immediately that jumps to 4.84 inches. So you can see why that physically larger block gives me the ability to make a physically larger piston, but still have the same amount of cylinder wall thickness to contain all that cylinder pressure. So if I can't just keep making my bore bigger and bigger and bigger, maybe I could attack it from the stroke. Maybe I can make the piston travel a farther distance. That's not a free lunch either though, because I get limited physically by the block. As that crankshaft swings around the bottom of the block, I need clearance between the crankshaft arm itself and the connecting rod so that it doesn't hit the oil pan rails, the bottom of the cylinder, or come up and hit the bottom of my camshaft. There's only so much room in there, and so I can't just keep making the stroke bigger forever. As well as, in order to make the stroke bigger, if we go back and think about our crankshaft, we have to move that rod pin further and further away from center, so the arm there gets longer to give us that stroke. But that means we lose some stiffness, and you could potentially have now a crankshaft that has more give and more flex. That may not be ideal either. All right, well, now that I've done everything I can do to maximize the displacement of my engine by working within the physical confines of my block, I've made the bore as big as it can be safely, and I've made the stroke as long as it can be physically to fit in there, I'm kind of out of options to get more displacement. But remember, my airflow isn't based only on the displacement, but also how often I do the work of displacing that air. So what I mean is, another thing we could look at is not necessarily how much air I'm moving per cycle, but how many cycles I'm doing per minute. You'll remember that our airflow is in cubic feet of air per minute. So by increasing the engine's speed, the RPM goes up, so I'm completing more cycles per minute. Well, that sounds great. So why don't I just turn the RPMs all the way up to 11, right? It's not really that easy though, because a couple of things happen. As my engine speed starts to go up, the amount of forces inside the engine are also going up. The crankshaft is spinning faster, the pistons are moving up and down faster, and that puts greater loads on things like the wrist pin, which is holding the piston onto the connecting rod. It's trying to pull that connecting rod in half, and it's putting more load on the rod bearings that are holding the connecting rod to the crankshaft. So not only do I get higher loads there that stresses my engine, but I also get more friction from making those bearings and pistons go faster and faster and cover the same distance in a shorter period of time, but also more often. So as my engine speed goes up, my friction goes up, and the load goes up. But if you can withstand all that, you also have to consider the idea of supply and demand. So as my piston's going up or down, demanding more airflow, it gets that airflow from my induction system. That's the cylinder head, your port, your valve job, your intake manifold, your throttle body. And if any of those are a limitation in the system, well, then there's a roadblock. I can't fill the engine as fast as it's demanding airflow as that engine speed goes up. So I want you to consider that how we make horsepower is a function of how well we fill the cylinder. So every time we fill the cylinder with air and fuel, it goes bang when we light it on fire, and that's where the torque, or the force that we're pushing down that piston and rotating the crankshaft with, that's where that comes from. Power is how often we can do that. So I can't just keep going faster and faster and faster and maintain the same amount of engine torque simply because my airflow begins to fall off as I can't keep up, and my friction and drag are going up as my engine speed gets higher. So to make power, we have to fill the cylinder as well as we can, as often as we can. It's not as easy as just turning up the RPM, and even if we could get an induction system that can keep up, and a crankshaft and a connecting rod and a wrist pin that are strong enough, we also have to consider the valve train stability. Those poor valve springs, as that camshaft pushes the valve open and then the only thing there is available to close it is our valve spring, sometimes they can't keep up either, and we lose control of the events of valves opening and closing and timing and all that, and so that limits our power as well. As you can see, there's no easy way to go about this and get all of the things we want all of the time, so we got to make some decisions about displacement and engine speed that are going to affect the outcome of our engine. All right, I know what you're thinking. It's not just the size of the engine, and bigger isn't always better, but maybe there is a replacement for displacement. You're thinking, I know, boost. Whether it's superchargers or turbochargers, adding pressurization to the system definitely changes the game. But I want to make sure that we're clear. When you turbocharge or supercharge an engine, you don't change its volume. If we had a 6-liter engine like we talked about earlier, adding 5 pounds, 15 pounds, even 50 pounds of boost doesn't make the engine bigger than 6 liters, so our actual volume of displacement doesn't change. What does change though is our ability to burn more fuel, because when we use boost, the air that we're putting in the engine is more dense. Now in another video, we're going to talk about exactly the effect that density has on our ability to make power, so make sure and subscribe and stay tuned and we'll get that to you soon. But for now, just know that yes, there might be a replacement for displacement, but there definitely is no free lunch. Okay, well, we understand now what displacement is. We understand how engine speed affects it and what the limitations are for getting more displacement or more engine speed. So it's time to talk about what is the perfect engine size. I bet you thought I was going to tell you, didn't you? The reality is, it depends. There's a lot of factors that are really going to determine what's the right engine displacement for your project. Not the least of which would be, let's see, what's the budget? If you had a stock engine and you wanted to make it bigger displacement or get more RPMs out of it, it's not free. It costs a lot of money, and the higher quality parts you can afford, the more likely it is you'll be able to accomplish a bigger engine or a higher RPM engine. But if you're not limited by a budget, you might be limited by rules. Maybe you're racing in a particular class, and that class has a rule on how big you can make your engine. So now I'm limited to the displacement that the rules allow. Most of the time in that scenario, the racers are going to build to the absolute maximum limit, plus or minus whatever the fudge factor is in the measurement. Or some classes might have a maximum engine speed limit, in which case now you're going to do the same thing and figure out how to get all that you can get. A lot of classes will allow you to build any size engine you want and turn any amount of RPMs you want, but they make the limitation now the weight of the vehicle that you have to use. So we call these weight per cubic inch classes, where if I build a small engine, I can have a lightweight car. If I build a really big engine, then theoretically it should be able to make more power, so my car has to weigh more. Now they do this to get parity so that everybody can race whatever size engine they brought, but the reality is there's always going to be something that limits your performance and your choices of what size engine to build. A few more factors that you might consider. For example, how big is your tire? Well, if I'm limited by the tire on my car on the street, then it doesn't do me a lot of good to make a really big engine that does lots of RPMs that's way more powerful than I have traction for. The same thing holds true for a racing body. If I join a class with a small tire, I might be allowed to build a really giant engine, but if so, there's only so much traction available, so I end up sort of choking down my engine's performance. Again, this is true in a lot of classes that race small engines against big engines. The advantage on the starting line for the small engine car with a small tire is that, well, it doesn't weigh very much, so typically they can get away from the starting line faster. However, if I build a really big engine, I can't get away from the starting line as quickly as the small lightweight cars. But if I take it easy and I don't break my traction, by the time we get rolling, now I can run the back half of the track much faster than the small engine cars can, and hopefully that ends up working out. One last thing for you to consider is gear ratio. The gear ratios either in your transmission or your differential are going to multiply the engine's torque output to help you motivate that vehicle that you've got going. So it would make sense then that the more gear ratios you have available, the more you can trade off between torque multiplication and maximum speed that you could get to. For example, if I had a big heavy vehicle, but I was limited to only 2 gears, let's say like a power glide transmission, it might make sense to build a larger displacement, big cubic inch engine with a lot of torque and a really broad torque curve, even if I couldn't do a lot of RPMs, because I'm going to see a big drop between the gear change from low gear to high gear, and I want to be able to utilize that engine's torque. If I built an engine that was a lot more what we call peaky, where it makes way more torque at one specific engine speed range, then it would be a benefit if I could have a transmission that would have more gears. So a lot of engines have 4, 5, 6, 7 or more gears, which really helps us keep the engine in a very narrow and specific range of power in the RPM range. So realistically, if you don't have any budget limits and you don't have any rules limits, if you really look at what professional racing categories do, you'll notice that almost always they will maximize everything they can. They'll build the engine to the largest limit that's available, and they will seek out ways to get more and more and more RPM, because if I can do that, even 2 engines that make the same levels of power but at different RPM levels, for example, let's say both engines make 800 horsepower, but one makes it at 6,000 RPM and the other makes it at 9,000 RPMs, all things being equal, if I have the correct gear ratios and the weights of the cars, typically the one with the higher RPM for the same level of power is going to win races. It's just not always that easy to maximize those RPMs. But if you've got the budget, the rules don't prohibit it, and you've got the patience to chase all it takes to do those RPMs, you'll win a lot of races at higher RPMs no matter what the displacement you choose.